from now. But through this crisis I will persevere. My vision's clear, plan to rise up out this hemisphere. Through God's will, I pray for better days. I weather stormy nights.
Hey yo, what's good with everybody, man? I hope everybody's having a productive day, feeling blessed, and like I always say, it's one life, one chance. We only got one chance to do this right. Let's get it done. With that being said, you guys asked me to do another chapter. I'm gonna do the whole book, and then I'm gonna go buy some more books and do it on those books as well, and try to create positive messages for the youth and those that are still involved in a lifestyle, but maybe are thinking about making a change. Man, I think it's important, we just give them that push, that little extra motivation if they need it. But a fun fact before I get into this video. Fellas, if you guys are dating a girl whose favorite holiday is Halloween, she's toxic, bro. She's dangerous. She's psychotic. If you can actually watch a Halloween movie and your girl's right there lusting over Michael Myers, and every time he does his thing and she's just looking at him like, ugh, hi, or she gives you that evil laugh when he's doing something in the scene like, she's toxic, bro. No woman on this earth her favorite holiday should be Halloween. Food for thought. Just helping you guys out. And ladies, you know you agree with me. So with that being said, hit that subscribe button, hit that like, always leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Check the links in the description, man. Thank you. In this chapter, it talks about the Mexican Mafia history, the beginning of it. Everything that took place in 1957 at, Tracy DVI, which was pretty much in a facility where they sent young, youth offenders, juvenile offenders, who had, violent tendencies, violent history, and violent reputations. This was where they all ended up. And this is where the Mexican Mafia actually founded itself based on the ideologies that they wanted to unite all these Mexican street gangs and all these Mexican gang rivalries and create a gang of gangs in the same sense like the Italian mafias did. They said pretty much the very first individual that brought this to light and conceived this idea to formulate the Mexican Mafia and unite all raza and unite all these Mexican street gangs together into one was Luis Huero Buff Flores from Hawaiian Gardens. Now, I've heard about that neighborhood a lot, and I heard it's down there in LA. It's a big gang in LA. He had a great idea. Obviously, back then, everybody describes the whites and the blacks, mistreating raza within the penal system. So I get where his idea was coming from. So obviously, conceiving the idea of uniting a raza together as one, regardless of how it turned out, regardless of the outcome of it, regardless of the perception now as being notorious and ruthless and violent and a mob, it was still a beautiful idea to protect our people. Because even to this day, man, if I see a paisa getting hurt or getting mistreated out there because he works the field or he's an illegal immigrant and some white guys or some racist people were just disrespecting him, I would say something to protect my people regardless who they are. But they say that he had this mystique and crazy fascination with the Italian mafia. Hence, that's why he actually labeled La M and labeled the group itself the Mexican Mafia. And uniting every single one of these street gangs into one, and who all joined in the beginning of its time, the founding members, he came up with the term carnales, united as brothers. But the way that Boxer and Mundo describe not only Huero Buff, but themselves, is that they pretty much wanted to terrorize the penal system and pretty much enjoy the luxuries and have fun in it. They wanted to control the yard so that way they can just live the good prison life. That they did anything by any means through extortion, through fear. That if you pretty much resisted La M, you were going to be hurt, beaten, or, So basically the concept started off as a beautiful thing, but ended up, becoming corrupted by criminal minds and thinking that the only way we can take over power control and become a powerful organization is through certain levels of violence, certain levels of demonstration. But you got to understand, back in those days, the way a lot more people were getting away with a lot more things, and it was a lot more easier to get away with things because of lack of cameras, lack of security, prison administration not really knowing what to do at the time because these prison gangs were barely formulating, like the Bluebirds turning into the Aryans and the Blacks uniting under the BGF, the Marxist group with their Marxist ideas. All these beginning members that actually came together and formulated this concept of brotherhood, this Mexican Mafia, all of them had violent reputations. All of them were ruthless. All of them were aggressive. All of them were fearless. And the thing about it is that through this chapter, as he illustrates the history of it, they pretty much ended up conducting a lot of violent affairs that took place in DVI to the point that the prison administration finally said, you know what, we're going to transfer these guys out. Let's send them to San Quentin. Let's send them with all these hard criminal adults, these young kids that are like 15, 16, 18 that were in YA. Let's put them around the prison system where, you know, the whites and the blacks run everything. And let's see if, you know, we can discourage them to stop them. But that only made matters worse because he describes countless times all the beginning members of the Mexican Mafia. You know, Hatchet, Apache, Benji Topo Peters, Hondo Lechuga, Jesus Pedrosa. This one was my favorite one. They said his name was Eddie Potato Nose. Didn't say what neighborhood he was from, but his name was Eddie Potato Nose. And last but not least, Cheyenne Cadenas. And everybody's heard that story about Cheyenne. It talks about it in the book as well. That a black individual, you know, called him the B word, said he was going to be his woo, 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 and try to take the yammies. And, you know, Cheyenne did what he had to do on the yard. Now, I'm not saying it that I believe the story, and I'm not saying it to credit it or discredit it, but I highly doubt it. If these individuals were violent offenders and had the reputation and the level of violence that they demonstrated, I highly doubt that this man was disrespected in that fashion. Maybe he was said something derogatory or called something derogatory and he reacted. But these individuals were willing to throw their lives away at a young age to prove themselves to their brotherhood, prove their loyalty to the brotherhood, but actually show the rest of the penal system and everybody else and all these other inmates who kind of look at Mexican as less than and inferior, that they're not to be messed with. You know, they credited, like, you know, the Clovers, Big Hazard, the Avenues, Maravilla. I guess Maravilla has like multiple gangs into one. You know, Hawaiian Gardens and a couple other barrios that were from East Los Angeles as being where they began recruiting candidates, potential candidates and members to become ME. And then it also says that you have to be sponsored by an ME member in order to be, you know, at least recommended, but you had to be voted in by the group. And they said they were very particular about the individuals that they recruited. You had to have violent history. You had to be willing to demonstrate violent history. Pretty much that you had to live in secrecy, that the ME never existed. But you had to make a promise to them that you won't hesitate, that you won't falter in your belief system, that you're willing to do whatever it is that they ask for you. You're willing to commit these levels of crimes, these acts of violence, and any infraction committed on behalf of La M or to La M was punishable by you know what. But look at the story behind the story. These individuals were kids, had a great idea, just had bad reputations, had bad habits, bad attitudes. See, it's hard to pass judgment on them because, you know, the streets of LA after the Zoot Suit riots and how everybody was mistreating Mexicanos, everybody knows that a lot of these neighborhoods created these gangs in order to protect their barrios, protect their communities, to protect one another from, you know, racists viewing them as, you know, we don't belong here. If you guys are familiar with the Zoot Suit riots and what took place and how Mexicanos were really getting mistreated, but you know, that was the time that, you know, a lot of immigration was taking place on that border and Mexicanos were flooding the United States looking for work, looking for help, looking for shelter, looking for a home. You really can't pass judgment on why these individuals grew up the way they did, with such violence, with such behavior, because they were doing what they had to do to survive. You know, LA is a big city, it's a beautiful city, but you know, it has its own history in itself about what people went through, what a raza went through, how they've been mistreated, how they've been abused. You can see why when these kids had already entered the system, they became the people that they needed to become in order to protect themselves and survive. Because, you know, like I said, what you hear about today in prisons, back then, it was a lot more violent and it was a lot more worse. Survival was a lot more harder. If you listen to a lot of these veteranos and a lot of these people on these channels that have been in the prisons in the 80s and 90s, hear their stories and compare it to our stories, there is no comparison. Those years were brutal and barbaric and ruthless to live in. Now, it goes on to talk about, you know, certain pegadas that took place within the penal system, you know, with Pelon, with Hatchet, with Apache, what they had to do. There was an individual who disrespected La M and it was bad mouthing them. So they sent, mafia soldiers to take care of him as well. They were doing a lot of demonstrations in order to claim superiority over the yards, to let everybody know that they're not to be messed with. But that's what they had to do. That's a sacrifice that they had to make as a brotherhood and coming together in recruitment to show everybody that, the time of, extorting and abusing Mexicanos was over. He does provide a small portion about, Ramon Mundo Mendoza, talking about that he was pretty much accounted for over 20 hits alone within the penal system. One that had to do with a machete, as well as, Richie Reese and Eddie Moreno, aka Pelon. They took out a couple of individuals on the yard in a gymnasium. But overall, it's basically saying that, they were trying to make a career out of committing crime, and that their quest for power and control over the streets and the penal system, it did get to their heads in the beginning. Once they reached almost 30 members, most of those 30 members that were actual made members, carnales, for the Mexican Mafia, were all individuals that used to be leaders from their barrios in the streets of Los Angeles and down south. So they were able to utilize these potential leaders that already had barrios looking up to them as a means to start branching out and reaching the streets a little bit more and taking over the trade, the trafficking, the prostitution, so on and so forth. Even so that two of their own, one was done in San Bernardino County and one was done in actually the county jail. These two individuals, obviously were utilizing the Mexican Mafia title, the status, either weren't paying homage. One of them actually was given something on consignment and instead of selling it, used it. And these individuals were found later on. But it was the Mexican Mafia's message of saying that they won't hesitate to take out one of their own in the process if they don't abide by La M, the Mafia rules. Now, as a Norteño, I remember in the Historia that we were taught, they had mentioned a couple little groups that formulated. Pretty much was groups that in secret try to rise and resist La M, but the M found out about it and took them out. One of them being La Familia Cinco, which was I think it was 3 Mexican Mafia members and 2 Fameros that came together in resistance. But then they say in the mid-60s, like 1961, 1962, is when Nuestra Familia began establishing itself in solidarity, creating a stronghold for itself, and began resisting the Mexican Mafia's ways and their tactics, their bully tactics, so to speak. Then obviously in 1968 was the commencement of the shoe war. And everybody's heard about the shoe war, about, Robert Robot Salas and his boots getting taken. And then they said from that time on to 1972, it was a reign of terror, a big extreme bloodbath that took place. Over 36 victims altogether, and they're saying the Mexican Mafia was responsible for 30 of them. But if you think about it, from then on to today, the division that was created, you have the Nuestra Familia, then they created their foot soldiers, Norteños, then you have the Mexican Mafia and their foot soldiers, Sureños. All this, for the last 5 or 6, 7 decades, all the street violence, all the street terrorism, all the innocent victims, all of this was created and done behind a pair of boots. That's how serious it was back then, and that's how serious it became now, that there's so much hate and ongoing levels of violence because somebody got their boots took, in all actuality. I mean, yeah, we can label all the abuse and mistreatment and the inferior treatment of what's taking place, but back and forth, we can outline so many things each side can, point out against one another. But all this stems from a pair of boots. So all these lives that were lost in the last 7, 8 decades behind the walls and on the streets was behind a pair of boots. It was Cheyenne Cadenas from Bakersfield, who actually is labeled one of the co-founders of the Mexican Mafia after Joe Pegleg was labeled the Godfather right before the shoe war happened. Pretty much was the one that he had a vision. He had a vision for La Raza. He was like, man, these are brown men fighting one another, that we needed, at least have a primary and, some kind of peace treaty, at least a ceasefire momentarily so they can come up to and establish a mutual agreement. But all his brothers were pretty much like, man, we're not going to negotiate with these farmers. But he still chose to do so anyways, asking the prison administration to go get transferred to Chino Palm Hall which was an NF stronghold. But see, remember back then, just like the movie Blood In and Blood Out, how Montana asked for transfers and did this and that. These powerful men had that kind of connections and that kind of communication with the prison administration that the prison administration was willing to help. If you watch Paradigm Media News, he talks about one of the carnales actually reaching out and talking to the governor to establish a peace treaty with the Mexican Mafia and the NF so they could be released from ADSEG, Corcoran Shoe and Pelican Bay. I can't remember exactly what he called that treaty, but it was in Spanish, even though the governor was like, when we don't negotiate with criminals and terrorists. But still, these individuals had that political connection to actually reach out and get this done. So Cheyenne does that, ends up on Chino Palm Hall, thinks he's going to go over there and negotiate, and then you guys know the story from there. And it's crazy that one of the carnales that they mentioned was Tiny Contreras from San Jose. He actually admits that he wasn't even involved in that. But the historias that I've read and I've Xeroxed and passed around was like he was the one waiting at the bottom to finish it off. But to this day, he denies it. He said he had no involvement in it whatsoever. I don't know if, he's just trying to keep the Almerta intact, code of silence. But that's what happened, and that's what this chapter talks about. And this all took place before Boxer became heavily involved into the Mexican Mafia. The following chapters will speak about his rise into it and what he's done and how he committed himself and the acts that he's done to get involved in the Mexican Mafia alone. But think about it. 30 members caused this much reign of terror. A lot of terror. These individuals band together as brothers under the concept and objective just to unite Raza. But that's all it took, was uniting a Raza and seeing that there can be power that could be gained from it, control that could be gained from it. And not only do they take out other inmates who oppose them, but they automatically in the beginning of time, when they first started, were taking out their own brothers. Think about it. Mexican Mafia member named Jimmy Lopez got something on consignment, but instead of selling it, he used it because, he's an addict just like the rest of them. And he got taken out. Beginning of time that they were created up until this point, and throughout this book that I'm going to continue to talk about on YouTube, you're going to see the demonstration, the perpetual cycle of violence that you're going to exist in if you choose to go down this lifestyle. Look at these kids. These kids were in YA, going to adult facilities. They were committing crimes that would give them life without, just to protect themselves, just to have a name, just to have a reputation. They did all this for a reputation, to feel superior over other inmates and to protect one another. They were throwing their lives away before they even got to enjoy life itself, to know what life was really about, what life was really like. So they're going to ask the same from you. And somebody left a comment in my comment section on one of my last videos. He just came out from the facilities. And he was like, what's crazy is that a lot of these youngsters now, a lot of these Sureños are starting to see that these guys are just greedy and they just want power. And a lot of people now are on the yards with these individuals, and the big majority of them are not really out there doing favors for them or not doing anything for them. There's a very handful of people that will answer to them, and follow their will and carry out their orders. But he straight up said, he goes, there's a big picture. There's a lot of Sureños out there that see the bigger picture now and starting to realize, like, man, they just want to utilize them. And I think that's very smart for everybody to start understanding that these men, even though they created it on the concept of uniting the raza, are only out to control everything as much as they can. They united all these street gangs to work for them. So while these guys want to enjoy the prison system and the luxurious lives behind the walls, think about it. A lot of these names that I actually characterized in this chapter, they ended up passing away behind the walls. Joe Pegleg passed away behind the walls. So they can have all this power and have all this control, have all this money, but you're going to die in that cell regardless. And I think if me and you had a choice, I'd rather be out here free and die out here knowing that I live my best life than to be recognized as a pioneer of a prison gang only to die in a cell alone. So with that being said, stay tuned for chapter 3. And like I always say, it's one life, one chance. We only got one chance to do this right. Let's get it done. Peace.